Hello, in this video we're going to be introducing the Visual Studio IDE and talking about using GUI or graphical user interface objects. The objectives for this chapter are shown here on this slide. There will be two videos, two parts to the Chapter 3 lecture video. We're going to create a form in the Visual Studio IDE and add some buttons, labels, and text boxes to it. We're going to talk about naming conventions and properties that you can change, and how we add some code that will be executed when you click on the button, and using labels and text boxes for input and output. And finally, we will do some practice exercises, and you'll see that the coding that we do will look very similar to the coding we did in Chapter 2, but now we're using a graphical format instead of just a text-based application. So our applications are getting more realistic now. All right, so first, a couple of terms. The interface is the environment the user sees. So a graphical user interface, or a GUI, is an interface that involves, pictures, pictures of buttons and text boxes. Pretty much any application you see in today's world has a graphical user interface that makes the application more user-friendly and makes it easier for everyone to use it. We don't see a lot of text-based console applications anymore. So the applications we're going to be creating from here on out are going to look more practical. Now, in this online course, we are just going to be focusing on Windows form applications. So it's going to look like something that you might open up on Windows. Everything that you create will have that kind of look and feel to it. You can also use C# and similar languages to create mobile apps, but we're not going to be using those examples in this class. Conceptually, it's the same, but the examples and everything that I'm going to use are more well-suited to Windows applications. So that's the type of application we're going to be using in this course. So from this point on in the video, we're going to be using Visual Studio. So if you haven't installed Visual Studio, you're going to need to pause this video and download and install Visual Studio. The Community Edition is free. I have instructions on the course website for how you can download and install the software. If you already have it installed, then go ahead and open it up. Click on the Start menu and type Visual Studio and open it up. And when you open it up, you should see a start page that looks something like this. It might ask you first to sign in. You'll have to sign in with your Microsoft account. If you don't have a Microsoft account, you'll need to create one. They're free. But these later versions of Visual Studio often require you to sign in with your Microsoft account. And the nice thing about that is that then if you use Visual Studio on a different computer, you'll sign in and it will save all of your settings for you. So, for example, I have Visual Studio on my home computer, on my office computer, or when I'm teaching in the lab. Excuse me, I have Visual Studio there. So I just sign in and it saves all my settings. So if you're using Visual Studio on your own computer, you can set it up how you like. And then when you come to the midterm exam and you open up Visual Studio on the classroom computer, all of your settings should be saved. Now, once you're in Visual Studio, what we're going to do is go to the File menu, click on New Project. So we're going to create a new Visual Studio project. And as I mentioned, all of the projects we're going to create in this class are Windows Forms. So in this class, we're always going to click on this Windows Forms app option. Now, as I mentioned, there are many other types of applications that you can create. For the sake of simplicity and habit, we're going to always use a Windows Forms app. Now down here, you can choose a name for the app, and this is just like when we would choose a class name or a file name for the applications that we created using Notepad or whatever text editor you were using for chapters 1 and 2. So this app I'm going to name First GUI, and it gives you an option of where you want to save your file. Now I don't like that default, so I'm going to choose a different place, which if you've been watching my videos, you'll recognize it's just a code folder that I have on my desktop. So I give it a name, I choose Windows Forms app, give it a name, specify where I want it to be saved, and I click OK. Now it might take a second, especially if you haven't run Visual Studio on your computer for a while, like I haven't. This really is my first GUI in quite a while. And so this is loading. In the meantime, I will mention that what it is doing is it's creating not just a single file, but a whole folder that has several subfolders and multiple .cs files in it. Graphical user interfaces are a lot more complex than the text-based interfaces that we saw in chapters 1 and 2. So these GUIs that we're creating, we're not technically writing them all the way from scratch. Visual Studio is creating basically a template for us to use, and then we can start from the template and go from there. So Visual Studio allows you to visually design the forms, so you can click on things, drag and drop, and change the size all with your mouse and keyboard, rather than doing all of that manually in the code. So that's the really nice thing about an IDE like Visual Studio is it lets you do things more visually, and it creates the code behind the scenes. And then when you want to create, the logic for what your application actually does, then you access the code behind the scenes and make edits where you need to. All of the concepts that we learn in this introductory course can be implemented in text programs or in GUIs. So you might notice in your textbook, in later chapters, it might continue to give examples of a text-based application, but you could do the same coding and concepts of everything we learn in this class also in a GUI. And so that's what we're going to do. GUIs are more, as I mentioned, practical. They seem more realistic. So from here on out in this course, everything that we create, we're going to do it in a GUI. So if you see an example in the textbook, it will be in the text-based or console-based, but you can apply the code with minimal changes to a GUI application. All right, it looks like Visual Studio has loaded, so I'll jump back to it. Okay, so I want to point out a couple of things. First of all, on the right, you might see a Solution Explorer and a Properties box. We're not going to do much with the Solutions Explorer in this class. It is a really useful thing, but we're not going to mess with it much in this class. I did just want to point out that in this single project, we've got several different files that it shows that are part of this application. So there's a Form1 file, there's a Form1.designer file, there's a program file. So it's more than just a single file. I believe the program.cs file is where the main method is actually stored. Yep, there it is. And we're not actually going to mess with the program.cs file at all. So all we're going to do is work with the form that we have created. All right, so I actually am going to change this a little bit so that the Solution Explorer doesn't take up as much room, because what we are going to be using a lot in this class is the Properties window. The Properties window is where you can change any property of any form or control. So right now we have all we have is a blank form selected, and we can see over here there's probably about 100 or maybe more than 100 properties for a form. And every single thing that we use in a GUI, whether it's a text box, a button, whatever we add to our form, it's going to have a similar properties box that we can mess with. Not really mess with, but use for useful purposes. All right, and then over on the left, there is a toolbox. This is going to be something that we will use on a regular basis as well. It looks like it's taking a minute to load. Again, I haven't run, oh, there it goes, Visual Studio in a while. So if you don't see any of these on your screen by default, you can always go to the View menu and find them there. So for example, there's Toolbox, here's Properties window. So if for some strange reason, if you open Visual Studio and those aren't there, you can find those by clicking in the View menu. Jump back to the slides. Okay, so as I was mentioning, there are 100 or more properties of forms. Now, for most of this class, there's probably only, I don't know, 3 or 4 that we're really going to use, because we're really focusing more on the logic of programming and not necessarily on what your form looks like. But if you're concerned more about, the design and the visual look, aesthetics of your form, then there's a lot more properties for you to explore in that properties box. And I would encourage you to do so. Don't be afraid to explore those properties. But only a few of them we will be using for the majority of the class, such as the text property and the name property, and those really are the main ones that we're going to be using. When we get towards the end of the course in chapters 12 and 13, that's when we actually talk more about the design, the visual aspects, and we'll talk about a lot more of these properties. Okay, as I mentioned, the toolbox is where you find the different GUI elements, which we call controls, and you can drag these from the toolbox onto your Windows form. So a form, by definition, is a rectangular graphical interface that can contain other controls. The controls are things such as buttons, text boxes, or labels that will help us to navigate a program. You can move the controls around on the form, drag them, change their size, delete them. It's pretty intuitive, actually, the Visual Studio. And I'll show you some examples of it in just a minute. I just wanted to make sure that we go over these terms in the slides first. Another table with properties. Again, not only the forms, but every single type of control that you can put on the form has 100 or more properties associated with it. So here we have the common button properties. Again, we're going to be talking about and using the name, the text, are the ones we're going to be concerned about in this course. And you can, of course, change the others, the background colors, the fonts. You can feel free to explore those things on your own. Okay, before I talk about that, let me jump back to Visual Studio. Okay, so here we have a form, which basically is a window, right? It looks like any application that you would open in Windows. As I said, it's fairly intuitive. You can change the size of it around just by dragging it. And every time you make a visual change in this design view to your form, it changes the code in the background. So somewhere there's some specific C# code that says like the exact dimensions of your form and all of that. But we're able to just easily change those things by clicking and dragging. All right, so if you open up your toolbox and open up this menu called Common Controls, here are some of the more common things you might see in a Windows application. And we will talk about a lot of these toward the end of the semester, but for today and throughout most of the subsequent chapters, we're going to be mainly focused on 3 of them, which are a button, a label, and a text box. So we're going to use a button for executing our code. So when a user opens this application and they click on the button, then usually when you click on a button in an application, something is going to happen. So we use the button to execute some code. We often use a text box to get input from the user, and we can use a label to give output to the user. So here we've got a pretty simple form so far. Just a text box, a label, and a button. And you'll see that as I click on each of these, over in the properties window, it changes to show the properties of that particular control. So when I have the text box selected, you can see over here, text box 1, and it's got all of the properties for that text box. If I choose the label, it does the same thing, shows the properties of the label, and so forth. And if I click just on the outside form, it goes back to show the properties of the form. Now, this program that I've created doesn't really do much so far. I haven't really put any code into it. So it's just got an empty text box, that label, it says label 1, and a button that doesn't do anything. But before we go any further, I wanted to show you how you execute a program from Visual Studio's IDE. So you go to the debug menu and then choose Start Without Debugging, or the keyboard shortcut is Control F5. And this will take you into what we call runtime. So when you're using Visual Studio to create things, that's design time. And then when you click Start Without Debugging, it compiles and runs your application. And while you're running your application, that's called runtime. So you might have heard the term runtime error before. That means an error that occurs while the user is actually using the application, as opposed to a syntax error. So now we no longer have to go back to the developer command prompt and manually compile our files. When we choose Start Without Debugging from the Visual Studio menu, it compiles and runs our application for us. So in Visual Studio, here it is, the debug menu, Start Without Debugging. And at that point in time, if you have no errors, then it will compile and run your application. If you do have errors, then when you try to select that option, it will indicate to you that you have errors, and it will show you where those are. So here is the form that I've created. I'm running a Windows application. It's built it for me to look like a Windows application. It's got the minimize, maximize, the red X. I can type in the text box, and I can see my label. I can click my button, but of course I haven't added any code to this, so clicking the button does absolutely nothing so far, but we'll get to that point. So I want to close that back out and jump back to a slideshow. Okay, so how do we actually add functionality to our form? Well, we're going to add the functionality to the button, right? when the user opens the application, we don't want a lot of stuff to go on. We want to program our application so that something happens when the user actually clicks on a button. So it's really easy to start doing that once you have a button on your form. If you double click it, you will create a method that executes when the user clicks on the button. And then you can switch back and forth between the design view and the code view. I want to show you that because it's really important to understand. Okay, so I've got a button here. If I double click with the mouse on this button, it jumps into some code. Let's see if I can zoom in a minute. I'm not typing any code right now, so hopefully you can just see that there is some code here. So it's created some code. As I think I might have mentioned in past videos, it's automatically put in some namespaces that are commonly used, such as using system, which we're familiar with. It's put in some others that are specific to GUIs. It's created a namespace, a class, and some methods. Okay, we don't have a main method in this particular file because the main method is in a different file that is associated with this application. But what we just did when we double clicked on the button was we created this method that is called button1 underscore click. And so whatever we put inside of these curly braces is going to execute when the user clicks on that button. So that's, in programming terms, that's what we call an event. So an event is when something happens to the application, like the user clicks on something or they type something, and events are generated which then cause the program to perform a task. So a click event would cause this button1 underscore click method to be executed. Right. Again, we're going to be talking more about the concepts of methods in a lot more detail in Chapter 7. So for right now, you don't need to understand, all of these parameters that are inside the parentheses. Don't change these parameters or any of these keywords. What you want to do is just change the code inside of the method that you have created. Okay, so when you've created an event method, you can then jump back and forth between your design view and your code view. So on the view menu, the very first two options are code and designer. So right now we're in code view, and we can jump back to design view as needed. Okay. So that's buttons. So buttons are usually what we associate with the code. And then labels and text boxes are the other things we're going to be using a lot in this course. Labels are basically just text. They're controls that you use to display text, like output. And then text boxes are how you can get input from a user. And I will talk about those by example rather than just reading through these slides. So an example that the textbook gives, which I'm going to replicate in this video, is where a user inputs two numbers into a text box, two respective text boxes, and then when the user clicks on the button, the sum of the two numbers will be displayed in the label. Okay? So the code to actually do that addition goes in the button click method. And there's the code they used. Our code might look slightly different, but let's jump to it. Let's do the example. So here in our example, we've so far only added one text box, one label, and one button. Let's go ahead and add a second text box. And let's move the labels up. I often put a label for every text box I have, so that we can add some description and tell the user what to do. So we have a label there. Let's add a second label. And then a third label over here. Now, it's not very useful for these labels to say label 1, label 2, label 3. So if you click on them and then go over to the properties box, in the properties box, you can sort it either by categories or alphabetically. I like to sort it alphabetically, so I can find exactly the property that I'm looking for. So if you click on label 1 and then go over to the properties box and find the text label, the text property. The text property is the text that is shown in the label. So by default, it just says label 1. So over here in the text property, I'm going to change that to say input a number, and then I'll hit enter, and that changes the label to say that. Label 2, I'm going to have it say input another number. Now it's kind of overlapping, so I'll scoot it over a little bit. And then label 3 is going to show the answer. But I don't want it to say label 3. If I want this to be, let's say I just want it to be blank when the user starts the application, and then I want that label to actually show the answer to adding the numbers together later, then I can do that. The properties in the properties box correspond to what the properties of the controls when the user first opens the application. So if I want this to be blank when the user first opens the application, then I will leave it blank. Even though I want that label to say something different later on, the property I want it to have when the user first starts is blank. So I just removed that text from the text property. Now, I already showed you how to create the method for this button. So I don't want to double click this again. If I double click this again, it will create a second method, and I don't want to create more and more methods. If you accidentally do that, there is a way to undo it, which I'll show you in the next video. But for now, do not double click on this button again if you already have. If you haven't double clicked on it yet, you can do so. If you already have, and we've already been over to the code view, then instead of double clicking again, we're going to switch to the code view because we don't want to create another button method. We just need the one button method. Now, let me zoom in here. So you can see the code a little better. Okay, so now inside of this button click method, we're going to use some of the concepts that we learned in chapter 2. And we're going to do our coding just like we did inside of our main methods in the previous chapters. So what we want to do here is we want to take the input from the user. So the user is going to put some number into text box 1. You can see over here in the properties box the name of that text box 1. And the number from text box 2, and it's going to add them together. Now, actually, before we jump back to the code, I'm going to click once, not double click once on this button, and I'm going to change the text of that button. So if you go over to the properties box, go to the text property, let's delete out button 1, and let's type just add. Okay, now let's jump back to code view. All right, so how do we get the numbers that the user input from those text boxes? It's pretty straightforward, actually. We can just use the text box property from the text box. So every control has a name. So we have a text box 1 and a text box 2. And you can get any of the properties, the values of any of the properties in the code by typing the control name and then dot, and then it will give you a list of all of the properties for that control. So text is one of the properties from that control. So whatever the user types into the text box, that becomes the text property of that text box. And you can use any property the same way that you use variables. Okay, we talked about variables in chapter 2, how they hold values. The properties of a GUI control work basically the same as a C# variable. So this textbox1.text, you can think of it as a string variable that holds some value, a text value. So we can save that value to a variable. So for example, we could say string input and assign it the value of whatever is in text box 1. Okay, so I really want to make sure you understand this, because all of the examples we're going to use from here on through the end of the semester, if we want to collect some input from the user, we're going to collect it from the text property of the text box control. So you type the name of the text box dot text, and that is how you access the text that the user input. It's equivalent, not equivalent, but analogous to the readline method in our text-based application. So in chapter 2, we used readline to collect input from the user. Here, we're using a text box text property and then saving that as a string to collect their input. All right, now in this case, we're actually collecting a number instead of a string. So I'm going to change this to be an int variable and call it input 1, since we're going to be collecting more than one. Now you'll see that I have an error here. This is the nice thing about Visual Studio. It gives you these red squiggly lines when something doesn't make sense. And if you put your mouse over it, it will tell you what the error is. So it says cannot implicitly convert type string to int. So it's reminding me that the textbox1.text property, or I would even say variable, so this is a string variable, and we're trying to assign it to an integer. So we have to use the handy dandy convert class of methods that we learned about in chapter 2, and we can just stick this inside of a convert .toInt32 method. Okay, the convert.toInt32 method is used to convert a string to an integer variable. I will leave a comment for you since I will be posting this code. Convert user input to an integer. Oh, more than one. We have 2 text boxes, right? So for the second text box, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to have a second input variable. And now we're going to take the text from text box to text property. Don't forget your semicolon at the end. And if you forget what your text box is named, you can go back to your design view and click on it, and you can see in the properties box the name of your text box. So here we have text box 1, text property. Here we have text box 2, and we're using the text property. All right, so now we can do some calculations, whatever we want to do. We can use any sort of similar example that we learned from chapter 2. add the two numbers together. So int sum equals input 1 plus input 2. Okay, and now we want to actually show that answer to the user. So in order to show something to the user, we can use the label text property. So on our form, we had a label over here. Can't find it. If you have a blank label and you can't find it, you can click and drag to select it. There it is. And it was called label 3. So just like you can get information from a text property of a control, you can also assign a value to the text property of a control. So it can go on also on the left side of our equal sign or assignment operator. So here we can say label 3 dot text equals, and so what we're doing here is we are assigning a value to this variable. Essentially, we're assigning a value to the text property of label 3. So we can say we want label 3's text property to be equal to the sum. Well, sum is an integer variable, and label 3.text is a string variable. So now we have to convert back the other way. Up here we converted from string to number. Now we're converting from number to string. All right. I'm going to click Save Form 1. And now I'm going to run this. So from the debug menu, I can click Start Without Debugging, or if you want to use the keyboard shortcut, it is Control plus F5. Now I shouldn't have any errors because I don't see, any more red squiggly lines. Sometimes this takes a minute to pop up. There it is. So now we can try it out. If we input 4 and 5, the answer is 9. Okay. We have now basically recreated the example from the textbook and gone over the basics of how to open up and start a GUI project and add some code to it. In the next video, we'll do some more examples and I'll give you some more tips and best practices and hints.